Hi everyone, thanks for tuning in. So this week is the 30th anniversary of PlayStation. The console was released on the 3rd of December 1994, and it went on to sell over 100 million units worldwide, which was the first console in history to reach the 100 million mark. And so to celebrate 30 years of PlayStation, Sony have released this limited edition DualSense wireless controller for the PlayStation 5. Now, when it says limited edition, I don't know how limited this controller actually is, whether it's possible to buy this readily or if this is now sold out in most places. Now, I was able to get this because I signed up to like a mailing list when I heard that this was due to be released. So as soon as it went on sale, I basically jumped online and put my order in at once. When I was doing so, I noticed that there were also limited edition PS5 Pro consoles, the new PS5 Slim console, and the portable, all in this 30th anniversary color scheme. And I noticed that the consoles sold out quite fast, whereas the controller was in stock for, I would say, maybe a few hours. So I had, time to put my order in for it. Now, I have the standard PlayStation 5, the launch model, and I like to sometimes buy different colored plates for it, to change how the exterior looks. And I thought it would be nice if these 30th anniversary plates were sold separately so that you could buy those and put them onto the standard console. But it doesn't look like that's going to happen. And I think particularly for the launch PS5, it looks like pretty much that has been now discontinued and they've moved on to the Slim and the Pro. So you can see that the design of this new controller is obviously based on the first ever PlayStation controller with its light grey color and the four colored face buttons, which is instantly recognizable and something which they've moved away from, I would say, with their current controllers, where each of the four face buttons tend to be all one color. So it is very nice and very nostalgic to see them bring this back for this new controller. So, of course, I'm going to look at the controller itself out of the box in this video, but just as a little bit of groundwork, I thought we'd take a look back just at the original PlayStation controller for the first console, just to see the design, how it has progressed, and how we've reached this point. So let's begin by taking a look at the very first PlayStation controller. This controller brings back, I would say, many memories for those of you of a certain age. Now, I was actually 8 years old when the PlayStation was released, but I only got a PlayStation when I was 12. So my first controller actually was the DualShock. I never had this original model controller when I was a child. And I think it's clear when you look at this controller just from the front that it has been based on the Super Nintendo controller. You can see that it has the D-pad on the left, start and select in the center, 4 face buttons rather than the 3 or 6 which were on the Mega Drive controller, and shoulder buttons. Really the difference I would say between the Super Nintendo and PlayStation controllers would be the handles on either side, just to help to grip the controller, and 2 shoulder buttons on each side rather than just one. I suppose it shouldn't be surprising that the two controllers look so similar because, well, firstly, the Super Nintendo was the most popular controller of the time, and so it makes sense that if you're making a controller of your own, that you would be influenced by that. Also, the PlayStation was initially intended to be an add-on for the Super Nintendo, so it makes sense that the controller is quite similar. Just a few things I want to mention just while we're looking at this initial controller. First thing is the D-pad, which actually, as you can see, is not the same as the Nintendo one. This is because at the time, Nintendo had exclusive rights to use the standard cross shape, and so this is why every controller from a different company uses the same general shape but has a slight variation on it. So with PlayStation, they went for what looks like 4 separate buttons rather than, one cross-shaped D-pad. Another issue is the naming of the face buttons, the 4 buttons on the right, because many people will call them triangle, square, circle, and X. But if you think about it, the first 3 are all shapes, whereas X is a letter. And actually, PlayStation themselves refer to this button as cross, so that all 4 buttons are shapes rather than letters. The last thing I just want to mention about the face buttons is that each of them actually has a meaning. Initially, the designed in Japan was that the circle button was sort of yes or accept or go forward. This is because in Japanese, a circle is used rather than a tick to mean like correct or acceptance. The name of this button in Japanese is maru, which means like round or circle. And it's interesting that this button on the right is actually the same position as the A button on a Super Nintendo, or even now the Switch Pro controller, because this is the button that would be used in Japan to select something or to proceed to the next screen. So the X button, which most people in this part of the world would use to select something, in Japan, that is actually the button to go back or to return. Because in Japanese, this button, batsu, is used to mean like no or incorrect or not to proceed forward. And as you can see as well, this button on the bottom of the sort of 4 is also where B would be on a Nintendo controller. Now, the triangle button initially was supposed to represent like a viewpoint or a direction or, some form of camera control, whereas the square button was used to represent like a map or a notepad or some kind of menu system. Although it seems over time, most people have used the select or start buttons to, pause the action, open the menu, look at a map, that kind of thing. Interestingly, I also remember a time during like the PS2 generation of games where for a while triangle was used as like the cancel or return button, which is something that you don't see very often nowadays. I'm not too sure why that was, but yeah. Oh, and just one last thing, just before we move on from this controller. I'm showing you two controllers here because if you look closely, there's actually a slight difference between the two. One of these actually has slightly shorter handles or grips, whereas the other one has slightly longer. And this is because the initial smaller controller was designed for the Japanese market, and when the PlayStation was then released in the West, the controller was slightly redesigned just to make the handles or the grips slightly longer. This is also something that we would see done in reverse with the Xbox, where the initial controller designed for the Western market was quite big, whereas when the system was released in Japan, they made a slightly smaller controller designed for the Japanese players. So at this point, we're moving on from the standard launch PlayStation controller to the analog DualShock controller, which Sony released later on in the PlayStation's life, and which was, I would say, to some extent, influenced by the Nintendo 64 controller, which had an analog stick as standard, and also possibly the 3D controller released for the Saturn, which was designed for use with the game Nights into Dreams. One major difference is that with the PlayStation controller, they put two analog sticks in rather than just the one. And I think just as the PlayStation controller was based on the design of the Super Nintendo controller, I think following the introduction of the DualShock or Dual Analogue controller, pretty much most game controllers from then until today, I would say, have been influenced and based on the design first shown with the PlayStation Dual Analogue or DualShock controller, having two analog sticks rather than one. I suppose the only real difference is that Sony positioned the two sticks to be symmetrical with one another. And while Nintendo did have a similar design with the Wii Classic controller and then with the Wii U Pro controller, they have moved on to have asymmetrical sticks with the Switch Pro controller. And with the Xbox controller, it has used asymmetrical sticks ever since the first one. One thing I find interesting to consider is that I said most controllers after the DualShock have been based on the design of the DualShock, but one system which was released around that time or after was the Dreamcast. But the Dreamcast actually didn't use two analog sticks, it used just the one. I'm not sure why this is. I don't know if it's that the Dreamcast controller had been designed prior to the introduction of the DualShock. The Dreamcast was released initially in 1998, but had been in development prior to that. So whether they had begun designing that controller, then saw the DualShock, but decided just to keep the design that they had begun with, I'm not sure. So, as you're aware, the DualShock is very similar to the standard PlayStation controller, aside from just the two analog sticks added next to each handle. But the reason I'm showing you both controllers here is because there was the Dual Analogue controller, which was released prior to the DualShock, and there are a few differences. The Dual Analogue controller was only out for a short time. The difference is that it has quite long handles. It has no rumble or no force feedback functionality. And also that the Dual Analogue controller, if you look closely, the analog sticks are not the same. Rather than having this kind of textured rubber, curved rubber on the top. They actually have more of a convex design. So really just, personal preference. I actually, when I had my PlayStation as a child, I got the version which was had the DualShock controller with it. But as a controller 2, I actually bought a Dual Analogue controller at the time. Just one other very small difference between the two is that if you look at the shoulder buttons on the two controllers, the Dual Analogue controller actually has this small ridge on the R2 and L2 buttons. So, of course, there was a PlayStation 2 controller and a PlayStation 3 controller, which I'm not showing in this video because they don't have the same color scheme. There was no kind of grey color scheme for either of those to sort of look like the standard PlayStation controller. And also they're very similar in design. The PlayStation 2 controller is pretty much the same design as the DualShock for the PS1. The only difference is that the 4 face buttons are actually analog themselves. So depending how softly or how much you press down on those buttons will actually control have some effect on the game itself. And the PlayStation 3 controller, again, very similar, wireless, replaced the rumble entirely with motion controls for the first version, the 6-axis, which then the rumble was then added back in again for the DualShock 3. And the only other difference really is that they put a small PlayStation button in the center, where start and select are, to open up the menu. And I think the analog face buttons were actually removed entirely, as far as I know, for the PlayStation 3 controller. But anyway, let's move on to the PlayStation 4, DualShock 4, which had a 20th anniversary design, limited design, which is based on the PlayStation 1 grey controller. So let's move on and take a look at what is, to date, the final DualShock controller released by PlayStation. So this is it, the PS4 DualShock 4 in the 20th anniversary PlayStation design. I like this controller. I like the two different tones of grey. It's like a slightly lighter grey on the front, whereas the back, the grips themselves and the bottom of the handles has a darker grey. Also, I like that the face buttons are the same 4 colors as on the standard controller. Once again, as Sony had kept those 4 colored buttons all the way up through the PlayStation 3, and then with the PS4 they removed them for just having just one color with the PlayStation 4 as standard. So I like that for this controller they've actually returned to the 4 colored buttons once again. I like that the home button has the colored PlayStation logo, which, like the face buttons, had been just made one color on the standard controller. And I also like, just in general on the PS4 controller, that the handles, the grips, the back and the sides of the controller have this kind of textured feel to it, making it comfortable to hold. Also, interestingly, is that on the PS4 controller, although the 2 analog sticks do have the same rubber kind of texture as prior DualShock controllers, they've actually changed the design to somewhat resemble the Dual Analogue controller on the first PS1, because rather than the 2 sticks being entirely concave, where your finger could, or your thumb could slip off, these controllers actually have that small sort of, it's like a ridge around the edge, and then a slightly depressed sort of area in the center. So it kind of mixes the look, combines the look of the Dual Analogue controller, but with the feel of the sticks on the DualShock, so I like that. Just in general, on the PS4 controller, also the shoulder buttons R2 and L2 are more like triggers now, which I suppose they were to an extent on the PS3, and the start and select have been replaced by options to replace start and share to replace select. The PS4 controller also has a built-in speaker and place to plug in a mic. And I suppose one of the main differences with this controller is this large touch pad right up in the front. I have to say, I don't know if I use this very often. I don't remember many times when I used this in a game itself. Also, with the touchpad just being entirely black, sometimes I think that I would have liked if this was either the same color as the controller itself, or had something positioned, some kind of design on the black, whether the words PlayStation or DualShock or the logo of the console, just something really just to add to the design. I suppose one other thing just to mention I'd forgotten was that the PS4 controller also has this light bar which shows I think the level of battery left in the controller. And this was also something that was used, for example, with PSVR. The light bar was detected by the camera, and this allowed you to use the PlayStation 4 DualShock controller as basically a motion controller when playing with VR. So that is basically it for the PS4 controller and also for the DualShock controller in general, because after this, with the PS5, Sony moved on to calling their new controller the DualSense. Despite the name, the controller is still quite like the DualShock, but with some just small differences. And I personally do think that the PS5 DualSense is the best controller and the most comfortable controller that has been released for PlayStation so far. So let's take a look at not just the PS5 DualSense, but also this specific 30th anniversary version of it. So here it is, the PS5 controller. And just at first glance, in general, I would say the PS5 controller is quite similar to the PS4 controller in that it has the touchpad, although I do like, as I said in the last section of the video, that the touchpad is the same color as the rest of the controller itself. I just like that design. Also, it continues with this limited edition version to have the 4 colored face buttons, as with the standard DualSense controller, the 4 face buttons are again just one standard color usually. I like that they've also used 2 different shades of grey on the controller. The front and the back of the controller are actually the same shade of grey, and instead it's just this lower section of the controller around the analog sticks and the handles, which is the darker shade of grey. I like that the PlayStation button, again, like the PS4 controller, is coloured rather than just one shade. And yeah, all of the, I think all of the buttons and just the design in general have captured the look of the original well. The PS5 controller also has the light bar like the PS4, although the difference is that rather than being on the top of the controller, sort of pointing towards the TV as you hold it, the light bar now sort of shows on the front of the controller as you look down at it. The PS5 controller also has the mic built into the controller with this button that you can just press to switch the mic on and off. And when you turn around to the back of the controller, again, pretty similar to the standard PS5 controller, although I do like this nice this text here that says PlayStation 30th anniversary. One thing that is quite tiny to see, and so I'll try to show a close-up of it here, is that the grip on the PS5 controller in general, the grip, like the PS4 controller, has this nice feel, but I would say that the grip is more textured on the PS5 controller. And if you look very closely at the back of the PS5 controller, even just the standard one, you'll see that there are actually thousands of very small triangle, square, circle, and cross designs, lots of them all over the back and the grips of the PS5 controller. Well, on this controller, one slight difference is that they have also added a 3 in there as well. So when you look at the back and you see the 3 with the circle, it resembles 30, the 30th anniversary of PlayStation. So overall, I do think this is a very nice controller. I mean, I like the standard design of the DualSense just in general, but also I do like that this one calls back to the original design, which even, I do have to say, after 30 years, it still looks great. I think it's not just nostalgia. Obviously, you know, for people like me who remember this controller well, it immediately makes me think of that classic design. But I do think it just looks nice in general, even if this is your first ever time playing a PlayStation. I do think this is a nice controller, and yeah, I'm glad that I got it. I hope that this is something that people will be able to find. You know, I think that sometimes whenever things become very rare, it's sometimes when you want something for your collection and you can't find it, it's not available to buy new, and you have to look online, and you know, this sort of thing. So I do hope that in general, these kind of anniversary or special edition products will just be generally available for people to get if they want one. Just one last thing I just wanted to mention about this controller is actually the packaging. Now, obviously, when you look at it from the front and on the back, it does have that classic kind of PS1 design to it. But one thing I found quite interesting is that when you look at the sides, both sides of the packaging have this bright yellow color, which reminds me of more of the PS2. I remember when the PlayStation 2 was released, initially I got the PS2 when it was initially released, the standard version, which was in like a bright blue box. I remember a few years later, it was when the PlayStation 2 Slim was released, the black version. And I remember in the UK, it was released in this bright yellow coloured box. And I also remember that I have a memory card for the PS2, which was also released in this bright yellow packaging. You know, the piece of cardboard is this bright yellow with like a plastic covering, you know, transparent plastic covering over it. So you can let me know if there was, but I don't remember this color or this design being used for any kind of packaging on the PlayStation. I only remember seeing this design starting with the second console. So I do think it's interesting that although they have used this, obviously this controller and the box is based on the look of the original PS1 controller and its packaging, that there is like a slight nod to the PS2. So I think that's quite nice. And just before we finish up, I just wanted to show you one more thing, which is that if you look inside the box itself, on the inner cardboard, it actually shows a vast array of PlayStation related accessories and consoles going back through their history. So, I mean, you have the PS1, as in the slim version of the PlayStation console. I can see there's the iToy UMD, which was the format used on the PSP. You've got the Pocket Station there. Let me see what else. The PSVR2 controllers. You've got the Vita, PlayStation Portable. Even things like the PlayStation mouse, multi-tap, um, memory cards, and even that new controller, which is like accessibility controller, which can be used by people who are not able to use the standard DualShock. I can see the PSP Go in there. Um, yes, and just lots of different accessories. So I think that in addition to being a nice, way to celebrate the original PlayStation and, remember its nostalgic design, I do think this is probably altogether a nice celebration of PlayStation in general, including some of the more obscure aspects of the platform's history. Well, that's going to do it for this one, everyone. So thank you if you've watched up to this point. I hope you've enjoyed. And if you have, consider giving me a like. Leave some comments about any ideas or memories you have. Subscribe if you'd like to see more. And yeah, hopefully see you in the next one. Cheers.